In this video, I'm going to give you some hints and tips on how to paint people in a street scene in a minimalist style. So the reference footage and image for today were taken from the celebrations in Exeter for the Queen's Jubilee recently. You may remember I used a different part of this day, this footage, for a video a couple of weeks ago. So the stuff I'm going to do today is going to be a similar technique, but slightly different scene because it's a street scene as opposed to just a general crowd scene. And I'm going to use very different colors as well. So to begin with, I've used my A2 mixed media paper and a burnt umber watercolor marker to put a very simplified version of the scene onto paper. So you can see the key things I've done are to establish a sense of depth and perspective. And I've done that in two simple ways. The first is the rooftops of the buildings have been loosely indicated, and a diagonal line going from the center and then going down and to the right as the sort of edge of the street have been put in place. So very quickly that establishes a sense of perspective. And then the other thing is I've got three groups of people. I've got the three on the left who are large in frame. I've got the chap walking to the right who's a bit smaller, and then the group of five people off in the distance who are much smaller again. And because as people, ourselves, we're so attuned to looking at other humans, scaling the size of figures in your composition will automatically create a sense of depth. And you can also see that what I've done here is place the key figures on the left, the guy walking over on the right, and then back to center for the people off in the distance. So that gives a nice zigzag for the eye to bounce across, sort of 1, 2, 3, left, right, center, big, medium, small, close, medium, distant. So it's a very simple way of establishing a sense of depth. Now, just like the video a couple of weeks ago, in terms of the painting, I'm using interactive acrylic and a flat synthetic brush. And once again, I'm starting by establishing a sense of shadow and light in a very simplified way. So I'm just looking at my figures, and where I see something which I consider to be dark, I'm painting in my dark color. Now, last time I did this, burnt umber was the dark tone of choice, and that might be considered more conventional, I would say. So part of the purpose of this particular painting is to do similar technique, but to play with the limited palette that I'm using. So what I'm putting down as my shadow color in this video is simply pure cerulean blue. And a couple of things to mention here are, if you look at the reference photo, the chap on the left in the green shirt, you can see the right hand side of his torso is in a considerable amount of shadow, and I think most of that is coming from the signpost in the foreground. But whether it is or not, I decided to remove that in my painting. So that's another key tip. The reference, if you look at it, and everything that's going on there, there's a ton of different people. There's lots of signs, and there's a cone there. There are lots of shop signs. You've got McDonald's and other, various brands. You've even got a double-decker bus off in the distance. You've got all sorts of things going on. So part of the key with the minimalist style is just to pick, as the name implies, pick the very fewest things that you think you can get away with. And in general, I would go with groups of 3, 4 figures if you're going for the absolute minimum, for the aforementioned reasons. We want to establish a sense of depth. 1, 2, 3, as mentioned, is a nice sort of bouncing rhythm for the eye to follow. So while I was chatting away there, continue to add the shadow. This paper has a slightly textured surface. You can see some of that actually in today's video. If you look at the little ray of sunshine beaming across the paper on the right-hand side of the sheet of paper, you can see a little bit of that texture of the paper. And that means that as the paint on my brush starts to run out, I get a little bit of dry brush effect. And, you know, that's good for this type of painting. I think it adds a bit of visual interest. Now I'm sticking with the same size brush, even though I'm going to this smaller figure off in the distance. And that forces me to look at the biggest shapes of shadow and not to get too fiddly with detail. So generally speaking, if you're painting a crowd scene or a street scene and you're going to include figures, I would recommend avoiding painting a portrait, even in a sort of suggested way. So you really want to, you know, it's a minimalist style we're doing here, but in terms of the facial features, they really do want to be either non-existent, I would say, or very, very minimal. Because in order for the painting to appeal to, you know, the random person viewing it, unless you're looking to specifically depict a particular location, in which case the landscape and the buildings need to be clearly described, or you're looking to depict a very particular person, as you would for a portrait painting, then really, for it to have a general appeal and a visual interest, I think it needs to be fairly anonymous. Certainly the people need to be. Now for the windows, I'm just treating them very, very simply, and I'm not even copying the windows exactly in the reference. I'm just sort of being inspired by the general viewing angle. So some of the windows are just vertical brush strokes, but I am being careful with where I place those vertical brush strokes to ensure there's a sense of perspective, that we're looking up at these buildings and that they're disappearing off into the distance. And on the left, you can see I indicated an archway or an arched window. Now I'm getting a bit behind myself. My commentary is lagging my painting a little bit, but there we go. But the archway or the arched window on the left, the flat brush is great for that, because if you keep it vertical, as you sweep the brush up vertically, you get a knife edge. But then as you sweep left, it's kind of a calligraphy effect, and it automatically creates the underside of that arch and it gives you a shape which is appropriate for the viewing angle, or it's pretty close anyway. Now, a moment ago, I put a bit of a cast shadow in blue on one of the buildings there on the right. And again, that just helps to hint at something else is going on in this world. You know, light is beaming in from somewhere, and there's a gap between those two buildings. What's going on? If I could walk down this street and turn right in between the buildings, what would I find? Now for the sky, I added a bit of titanium white to my cerulean blue, and I'm just going to block that in as a simple shape. But you can see as I'm doing this, I've indicated the roof line and the edge of another building, but I've got no drawing line there. And that's another way of suggesting even more distance in this particular style. So the closer buildings are outlined in watercolor marker from the initial drawing, but that very distant building is just a shape of blank paper. Notice also that I've varied the numbers of people in my little groups, because I've got 3 in the foreground, I've got the solo guy, and then 5 off in the distance. And that's a good thing to do as well in general. You definitely want to avoid, I would say, 4 people here, another group of 4 people there, and another group of 4 people off in the distance. That may well happen in reality, of course, but I just think it makes for a more interesting image if you vary the numbers. Okay, so continuing with my theme of color experimentation, when I did this type of painting a couple of weeks ago, I stuck for the most part with the primary colors for my kind of overlay colors on top of the shadow stuff I've done. But here, having put down the blue shadows, I'm going with orange straight out of the tube. So this is a pre-mixed orange that I'm applying wherever I can see exposed skin. And I'm putting that right over the top of the cerulean blue. And because that's touch dry, that's given me a nice bit of optical mixing. and it gives me an even darker color for the shadows, which is somewhat different in tone. I guess it's pretty close to a brown, really, as you would expect, or it is a brown. So that gives me a nice bit of color coherence with the burnt umber that I used for the line work, and it also distinguishes those shadow areas from the pure blue shadow areas. So it all sort of, you kind of, when you do this minimalist style, what I find is you kind of end up creating little effects almost by accident, and then thinking, oh, that's quite interesting, I could use that elsewhere in another painting. Now, this was a bit of a spur of the moment decision, but I thought, well, I've got this blue. Orange is obviously complementary to blue, and it was a sunny, summer's day. I've got quite a lot of orange in the people on the left, so I thought, well, I'll just bang in a bit of orange on that building on the right, and I think that works quite well. I think it balances the painting quite nicely. Orange on the left and a good block of orange on the right. And it's dark enough tonally that it could still be a shadow color because the light's coming in from the right hand side. Okay, so now I'm coming in with some cadmium yellow, and I think possibly a bit of titanium white in that. And I'm just picking out some highlight colors here where the light is catching the people. So again, we're not painting portraits, and even though I've switched to a small filbert, I'm still looking at the big shapes. And so this is really great practice for painting portraits, even though I'm not going to strive for a likeness or paint any details. It kind of forces you to look at the person as a set of simple shapes. And you've got to think about, how am I going to place the brush to create that simple shape? And inevitably the brush will often give you not what you actually asked for. So, it's always or is often a little bit out. So it's kind of one of the challenges of working with features which are almost the size of the brush you're using, but it helps create a precision of mark making. Now, I've just had a thought watching this video back. As you can see, we've had very hot weather in Exeter recently, and the sunlight is beaming in across the paper, and you can see there are a couple of patches of a much brighter area. And it's, generally speaking, when I photograph my paintings, well, not generally speaking, always, I strive to avoid that kind of thing. But now I'm sort of thinking, actually, that could be an artistic move. You could create a painting and then deliberately light it so that it has, much like you would light a stage, you've got areas which are, under a spotlight to highlight those areas. And that might be quite an interesting thing to do, really. So deliberately have uneven lighting when you actually photograph a painting to create a print from that. I'm actually liking that idea more and more now. So just a second ago, it looked as if the light really was hitting those people, and yeah, I might have to experiment with that. But got a bit behind myself again. While I was chatting away, I applied a green on the people on the left, using a mix of the cad yellow and the cerulean blue. And now that same green, but with a bit of extra white, just to make it a bit paler, was applied to the shirt of the chap there on the right-hand side. And then a little touch of an even paler version of that colour for the people off in the distance. And that's going to be that one more or less done. So you can see this method is really quite quick. And if you simplify the composition, you can create a sense of depth in relatively few lines with relatively few people. And if you approach it with an open mind and a very limited palette, you can choose colors which you might not normally try to paint these things. So for example, I've used burnt umber shadows in the video a couple of weeks ago, but here the shadow color, or the starting shadow color, was pure cerulean blue. For the next painting of this type, you could go in the opposite direction. You could say, well, I'll use bright yellow for my shadow color, or blood red, or purple, or just a pale grey. There are lots of different ways to play with simple colour combinations and create different effects. So one of the ones I quite liked was the overpainting of orange on top of the cerulean blue. I think that gives a nice shadow colour. And then the other discovery I mentioned just a moment ago was this idea of beaming sunlight or just bright light across the painting when it's photographed. And as mentioned, I think I'm definitely going to have to give that one a go. There we go. So hope you enjoyed this video. Please remember to subscribe to the channel, and I hope to see you next Sunday for the next episode of the Sunday Art Show. Thanks very much for watching.